Hi. Well, welcome. We're talking with Professor Ari Kelman of the University of California, Davis, who's the author of a number of books, but his first book from a few years ago now was called, well, a modest few years, enough years to write a few more books in the meantime, was called A River and Its City. And it's a history of the relationship between the city of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. And we're going to sort of start out by talking about some of the background of that. And I suppose this was your PhD dissertation and then became your first book. And I'm just wondering, how did you decide on this topic?
Unfortunately, it's a terribly long story. I'll try and keep it brief enough that your students won't go to sleep. I went to graduate school to work on the relationship between Native peoples and the federal government during the era of the United States Civil War. But the scholar with whom I went to study passed away in the first semester of my first year of grad school. And I then became a sort of wayward scholar for about a year and a half. I dabbled with being a Latin Americanist because they had wonderful parties, but I wasn't interested in learning Portuguese. I spent some time thinking about writing a book about consumer culture in the African American community, but I ended up not doing that. And then this is a terrible, I'm embarrassed to admit this in front of your students, but I drove to New Orleans to see a friend of mine. And I was feeling particularly unclear about what direction I was going to take with my own work. And so I literally chose to take a vacation and clear my head. And I drove from Providence, Rhode Island to New Orleans, Louisiana, which your students may or may not know is basically down the east coast of the United States, the Atlantic coast of the United States, and then into the state of Louisiana and down Louisiana, at which point you arrive at New Orleans. For people who haven't driven into New Orleans, you don't realize, and I had never driven into New Orleans before this trip, that it is effectively an island. It was known originally as l'Île de Nouvelle-Orléans, the island of New Orleans. And so I drove into the city and noticed immediately that it was this very odd location, that it was surrounded by enormously high levees. And I was struck by this. And while I was visiting my friend and going out drinking every night and basically behaving in a way that was unbecoming of a young aspiring scholar, during the day I was going to libraries and looking to see if there were books written about this, and I didn't find anything that I thought was adequate to the task, and so I decided I was going to write that book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. You would think that, in some ways, you would think that that's such a natural topic, you know, a history of the river and the city, because that is sort of the whole reason that it's there.
Right.
But I think that's the knack of being a graduate student and finding a good topic for a dissertation, is finding something that actually is really obvious that nobody else has done
I think
before.
that's exactly right. I think the best histories that tend to get written are ones that answer a question that you don't have to spend 5 minutes explaining to an audience why it's important to ask and answer it. You just say, well, I wanted to write a book explaining why New Orleans is where it is because it's such an unlikely location for a city. No one else had written that book, and people then say, really? No one's written a book about why New Orleans is where it is? And you say, well, there's a geographer named Pierce Lewis who's written sort of a very, very short book, but it's not really about this, and off you go. And then I spent, as people writing dissertations do, I spent many, many years on research and writing, and then I rewrote it many times and turned it into a book, which you've inflicted upon your students because you're a sadist.
Well, exactly. And So I think maybe a bit later, I'll come back to the question of your original interest, because I think I understand your Sand Creek book, or at least possibly understand the origins of that. That actually is sort of an area that you'd been interested in previously. That's intriguing. So a river and its city, as you sort of say in the introduction, is environmental history, but a lot of environmental history had sort of started out, or at least in the United States historiography, had started out in the American West. And what was different, and there's some obvious reasons for that, you know, with the kind of dramatic nature of the environment and the dramatic ways in which human beings interact with the environment, you know, dramatic and fairly unpleasant ways a lot of times. But and also the role of government is very clear in a lot of the American West. But what was different about writing an environmental history of New Orleans was not exactly in the East, but it's not in the sort of part of the US where we could sort of say the center of gravity of environmental history had been?
It's a great question. So I'm going to try and give you a three-part answer. The first is that I'll just simply agree with you and say, historiographically, the way in which the field of environmental history evolved in the United States, it moved from the West to the East and then to the South. So it was an inversion of the settlement pattern of the United States by settler colonialists. It began in the most recently conquered and then settled part of the nation, and then moved gradually back into the area that had been settled earlier. And the reason for this, well, there are many reasons for this. One is that urban studies for many environmental historians was antithetical to the kind of work that they were interested in doing. They were interested in writing about pristine landscapes or wild landscapes or wilderness landscapes, call them whatever you want. They were not as interested in writing about cityscapes. I was far more interested in writing about cities, and I should say that I was not a so-called pioneer. I wasn't breaking new ground in this regard. William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis had come out a few years earlier, and for me, it was an absolutely critical, it was kind of a touchstone in my career. So the second way in which I would answer your question is simply by noting the historically constructed nature of regions in the United States. I won't talk about the United Kingdom because I know the context far less well, but in the United States, the idea that New Orleans is the South, New Orleans really only becomes the South when the South has a distinctive regional identity in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, as the United States begins to first inch and then hurtle toward civil war. Prior to that, New Orleans understood itself variously to be a Caribbean port, the northernmost Caribbean port, part of the West. Many visitors to New Orleans and residents of New Orleans understood it as the gateway to the West, to the American West. Or for many residents of the city, if you're talking about the period prior to, let's say, 1808 or so, as a part of Europe, as an adjunct either of Spain or of France. And so to think about it specifically with one regional designation was not something that I ever thought was useful. I thought it was more interesting to understand it as a place that was more, forgive me, I will keep using watery metaphors, but more fluid than that. And then the final thing that I would say is related to that is that fluidity for the work that I was doing was useful and interesting because it was the case, and it may still be the case, that New Orleans was understood by US historians and by most Americans, I would say, as being almost too distinctive. and therefore as not being a representative case of anything. And so when I was writing my book, I was very, very much writing a book that was rooted in place and in space, but I also understood it to be a book about themes that were broader and that could be exported from that one case to other locations. And so it was helpful for me to write about New Orleans, not as a Southern or a Western or a French or a Spanish or an American place, but as all of those things at once. Because I could then think about it as being almost a sort of a borderland where these different cultures and communities would come together, they would exchange ideas, and they would hash things out.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. That is something that I think about. I mean, I'm fairly new to the history of New Orleans, the history of cities in general, but that sense of exceptionalism, I think to some extent has prevented historians from doing just kind of basic, boring, you might say, urban history. So, you know, things like the dock board, the public belt railroad, which is anything but boring, actually. But basic things like, you know, the extension of public services and the development of city government and so forth, the scholarship on that is shockingly thin for such a significant American city.
Yeah.
And that's, I suppose, partly because there's so much other really interesting, exciting stuff that you don't necessarily get in the same way in Cleveland, or, you know, not to pick on Cleveland, but, you know, you've got jazz, etc.
I pick on Cleveland all the time. No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I suspect that there are others who would quibble with just how interesting the dock board or the public belt railroad really is, but I think you and I share a sense that they're fascinating subjects. But it's unequivocally the case that New Orleans is shockingly underwritten. It is understudied, which is terribly surprising because it's such an interesting place, and it really is. It occupies this extraordinarily important point in the American imagination, but it is, as you say, it's an apt word. It's understood to be exceptional, and so I think many scholars have looked at other places, whether it's been New York or Chicago or other urban exemplars. Los Angeles, obviously, recently has been there's been an entire Los Angeles school. The thing that I find fascinating about New Orleans, one of the many things that I find fascinating about New Orleans is that there are so many opportunities there to do this kind of work. And I continue to be surprised that there is so little scholarship that's coming out about the city. That, as you say, there are so many, I don't know, basic feels like a slur almost, but there are so many foundational topics that as yet have not been adequately explored. And so when I was doing my research, I was looking at MA theses. I had to look at a variety of different things to find secondary work, which had I been working on Chicago, as I said, or New York or LA or San Francisco, or even Cleveland, I would have had huge numbers of books to choose from. And again, it's particularly surprising given how incredibly important New Orleans was to the nation's economy in the 19th century. It really was a central place. It was an entrepot for the entire midsection of the continent, really, and yet we know comparatively little about it.
Yeah, and also considering how pleasant doing archival research in New Orleans is, which is something that should be obvious,
Yeah.
but, you know, maybe it's not.
Right, it's a great place to spend a few months. It really is, or a few weeks. It's it's a lot of fun. The food is delicious and not particularly expensive. Rents are higher than they are other parts of the South, but nowhere near as high as they are in, say, San Francisco, LA, New York. So you can afford to be there. No, I agree with you. It's very, very surprising.
Yeah. I guess the last question I wanted to pose, just sort of this very broad, about the introduction, is public space is a key way that you look at the interface between the city and the river, and that goes back to some extent to the unique French legal situation of the relationship of the city and the public to the space at the riverfront. But how does studying public space in a city where many of the residents are enslaved, for not all, but about half of the book, how does that differ from studying public space in a city without slavery?
So I'm going to give you a wholly inadequate answer that I expect is going to frustrate you and potentially surprise your students. I did a very poor job of thinking seriously about the way in which slavery was shaping the iterative nature of defining publics and public spaces in New Orleans. I did an all right job in the Steamboat chapter and perhaps a reasonably decent job in the chapter on the 1853 yellow fever epidemic, but it wasn't a category of analysis that I could have, and in retrospect should have used. And I have an excuse. And that's that I knew that Walter Johnson was writing Soul by Soul at the time, which was about New Orleans slave. Well, Walter casts the book as being much broader than that, but really it is about slave markets in New Orleans. And so rather than work in, well, either be nipping at Walter's heels or try and outpace him, I made a strategic decision that he was going to write that book and I would write mine, and that would be fine. Given the enormous runaway success of Soul by Soul, I obviously miscalculated, and I should be at Harvard now, and Walter should be out here breathing the foul air in California's Central Valley.